Now let's start things off by finding out about the life of the man whom fellow British playwright and bestest buddy Ben Jonson described as not for an age, but for all time, Shakespeare.
Part 1. Who was Shakespeare?
Section A. Shakespeare's Life and Times. Shakespeare was born in England in 1564 and died in 1616. He lived and wrote during a time known as the English Renaissance, the period during the reigns of the Tudors and the early Stuarts. This general period is known as the Elizabethan era, after Queen Elizabeth I. The English Renaissance was a time of immense creativity in culture and the arts, which drew upon the classical world, especially the Roman, with ancient dramatists and poets influencing the English Renaissance. Shakespeare grew up in Stratford-on-Avon, a small English town, then made his way to London, where he hooked up with an acting company.
Now, theater in those days was a lot different from what we're used to today. First off, actors weren't exactly highly regarded, falling in the social strata somewhere between pauper and assistant pauper. To put it simply, acting wasn't exactly the most respectable position around.
Shakespeare was a member of one of these theatrical companies, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, who by the turn of the century were performing at the famous Globe Theatre on the banks of the Thames River in London.
The Globe Theatre was a lot different from the theaters of today. Shaped sort of like an O, the Globe was a three-story wooden theater with an open roof in the center over the stage. Each floor had a gallery with seats for the audience.
The center area, known as the pit, was where the masses watched the plays.
Because they stood on the bare ground for the duration of the performances, these theater-goers were known as groundlings. These groundlings ate hazelnuts all day and, quite frankly, smelled bad.
We resent that remark.
Yeah. Why, I bathed just last coronation, I did.
He did.
I did.
The stage of the Globe extended partway into the audience and had a trapdoor in the middle. Behind the stage, dressing rooms were concealed, and a tower, known as the penthouse, stood atop the thatched roof.
Since this was before the days of electricity, performances were held outside during the day, under the sky, usually lasting about 3 hours, without an intermission.
Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, later known as the King's Men, also sometimes performed at indoor theaters. The company also performed for the court of Queen Elizabeth and later King James, usually during holidays and special occasions.
Oh, and another thing about Elizabethan theater. No women actors appeared on stage. Young boys played the female roles instead.
You know, it's true, in Shakespeare's day it was considered improper for women to appear on stage, so female roles like that of Cordelia, Ophelia, and Juliet were played by young boys. Does this make me look fat?
Shakespeare wrote plays that were performed at the Globe. Shakespeare wasn't just a playwright. He was also an actor and a shareholder in the company that owned the Globe.
Excuse me. My name is Francis Bacon, Sir Francis Bacon, a famous author and philosopher. I was also a close personal friend of Queen Elizabeth's. Some people think that I wrote all of these famous plays, not this Shakespeare guy. It makes sense. I was an educated nobleman, and I knew all about the royalty that Shakespeare wrote about. So when you talk about Shakespeare, remember me.
Excuse me, Governor.
Begging your pardon, Mr. Bacon, sir, but how did your geniusship die? I died of bronchitis. I was testing new theories of refrigeration. I died of bronchitis after killing a chicken and stuffing it with snow.
Pay no attention to Mr. Bacon. He was a towering figure in Elizabethan England, but he didn't write Shakespeare's plays, and he's still a little miffed about the way he died.
Anyway, during his time as a dramatist in London, Shakespeare wrote comedies like A Midsummer Night's Dream and The Comedy of Errors, history plays, all those Richards and Henrys, the Roman plays like Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra, and the romances, which include Cymbeline and The Tempest, and of course, the tragedies.
Here then is a general timeline of Shakespeare's life and works. He was born probably on April 23rd, 1564 in Stratford. By 1589, when he was 25, he had settled in London. His first plays are difficult to date, but they include Richard III, The Comedy of Errors, Titus Andronicus, his first tragedy, The Taming of the Shrew, and Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3. You see, even Shakespeare wrote sequels.
Now in 1592, due to an outbreak of the plague, all the theaters in London were closed down for 2 years. Shakespeare took advantage of this break to write 2 book-length poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. By 1594, Shakespeare was back writing for the stage, completing Love's Labour's Lost, Romeo and Juliet, Richard II, and King John in the next 2 years. Between 1596 and 1603, when Queen Elizabeth died, he continued to churn out plays, including The Merchant of Venice, Henry V, Julius Caesar, Hamlet, and Twelfth Night. Somewhere in this time, the 1590s, Shakespeare wrote his sonnets, which were a series of love poems that solidified his reputation as a great poet. After the turn of the century, 1603 to be exact, King James became the new ruler of England, and for Shakespeare, the hits just kept it coming. Between 1603 and 1608, he wrote several plays, including the great tragedies Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, and Antony and Cleopatra. After that, Shakespeare took it relatively easy. From 1608 to 1613, he wrote his last plays, including The Winter's Tale and The Tempest. After this time, the playwright retired, moved back to Stratford, and just lived the life of a country gentleman. He died on April 23, 1616. He was 52 years old.
Let's review. The playwright and poet William Shakespeare was born in Stratford-on-Avon, England in 1564 and died there in 1616. He lived and wrote during the English Renaissance, also known as the Elizabethan era, after Queen Elizabeth I. In London, Shakespeare was a member of the Lord Chamberlain's men, for whom he wrote plays, many of which were performed at the Globe Theatre.
The Globe Theatre was a 3-storied open-air wooden theater shaped like an O. Plays were performed during the daytime to take advantage of the daylight. Also, boys played the female roles.
In addition to writing some of the most famous plays ever created, like Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, and A Midsummer Night's Dream, William Shakespeare wrote 2 book-length poems and scores of sonnets. Not a bad life's work, eh? Now we'll look a little bit closer at Shakespeare's work, starting with his use of language.